Okay, well, welcome everyone to Protecting Privileged Access in the Cloud Era. I'm Alan Brokken. I'm a technology solution professional with Microsoft, and we're going to be talking about kind of privileged access management in the cloud. But the other thing I'm going to say is I realize that I am the last thing between you and drinks. I also realize that snacks were provided about an hour ago. So whatever sugar that you consumed should be hitting right about now. And so this is probably going to be maybe not the most interactive session from the crowd. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do right now is just take a deep cleansing breath to hopefully have the oxygen counter the glucose in your system so that we can participate, because this is going to be fun. So I think, as I said, I'm Alan Brokken. I work for Microsoft. I've got some interesting identity facts about myself. I created my first user in 1996 in Novell 312. Anyone else? Anyone? Novell 312 first time? Yeah, that's good. Oh, even better. Okay, so my first Active Directory deployment, though, I feel very proud about this one, was on NT5. It actually had NT5. And what was great about that deployment was the fact that there were no mouse drivers at the time. So you had to figure out all the keyboard commands to deal with the GUI. It was awesome. In 2008, and this is probably the most technically challenging thing I've done in my career, I got IAG 2007 to be a reverse proxy that authenticated using ADFS as the resource provider and Shibboleth as the identity provider for the United Nations. It was a big deal. Yes, thank you. Anyone that understands that knows that that is monumental. And part of the thing is I was a new consultant at Microsoft Consulting Services at the time, and everyone said it couldn't be done, but I didn't know that. And so it was one of those things, I figured it out. And then finally in 2016, I actually deployed a red forest. And so some of you, who knows what a red forest is? Yeah, some people, okay. It's a separate, for those that don't know, it's a separate Active Directory forest that is built explicitly clean source from the ground up. I literally spent 12 weeks in a customer's conference room building this thing. All the there was wiring to nothing. We had to bring in media from the outside, clean room, the whole thing. And we're going to talk about how that kind of concept of building your infrastructure from scratch, separated from everything else, like how can you even do that in the cloud, because everything's on the internet. On the side, I do a bunch of kids stuff. I write children's stories. I lead some different not-for-profits, and I play Destiny. So that's me in a nutshell. And now, you all are going to join me in the way of the Ninja Cat. Because protect we will the resources we shepherd now from online attacks. Can you say it with me? Protect we will the resources we shepherd now from online attacks. We're going to learn about the way of the Ninja Cat, so that today this will be the most exciting presentation you had. So we're going to start out with what level am I? Anybody ever seen Kung Fu Panda? Anyone? Anyone? A few of you? He starts at level 0. The question is, from a privileged access management perspective, are you at level 0? We are going to find out. You're going to actually do homework. So right now, just so you know, be looking. If you don't have a pencil or a pen or something, we need to get those. I think it's great that the conference gave these little cards. I think the card's the perfect kind of thing to do this exercise on. But I'll give you some background first before we do that diagnostic. And then we are going to explore the way of the Ninja Cat, the journey to securing our privileged access. So let's just talk about privileged identity theft, what it looks like and how it goes. I think a lot of you resonated with the whole Novell thing or been around for a while. And so you know how Joe gets permissions and then keeps them indefinitely, right? Joe says, hey, I got this upgrade. I got to do this thing. Can you just hook me up? And some nice administrator says, sure. What permissions do you need? I don't know. Okay, well, what do you need? I don't know. Okay, domain admin it is. Let's do that. And boom. Joe goes, does his job. Does anybody go clean it up? No, not really. It just kind of sits there, sits there, sits there. And so what about in the cloud? How does that work? Well, Joe now needs permission to exchange online. And so in the past, that would have been a domain admin, but now he gets global administrator because no one understands Azure AD RBAC. So because of that, they just throw him in global admin, and he logs in and he does his thing, but now it's stuck in this global admin role. And does anybody have any context? Global admin doesn't just affect that Exchange Online, it affects SharePoint Online and Yammer. And if you've got the little checkbox check, it affects everything you have in Azure on the other side. So that's pretty dangerous. The other thing about this is then, let's say that how this works out is Joe's like, oh, wait, dude, I got to do this thing. And it's Saturday night. And he was supposed to be out with his girlfriend or something. And now he's got to do maintenance from the bar. Because no one has ever heard of anyone actually doing that. But it does happen. And he's like, oh, wait, hey, I'm a global admin. I could just go change some stuff. So they whip out their smartphone app. And Microsoft's so awesome, we give you smartphone apps to manage Azure. Nice. And all of a sudden, Joe navigates to some websites after he's logged in, his credentials are lost, he loses control, and now the cloud is compromised. And I only bring this issue up because it's actually happened. Companies have lost control of their cloud infrastructure to an admin who's done silly things on their phone while they're logged into things. So everybody gets that, right? Does anybody want to see the slide with all of the statistics? Anyone? Someone actually, you want to see the statistics? No. You've seen the statistics like all day long. Everybody has that slide, so I took it out. But I think the important thing we need to think about when we start talking about this is, what does Joe really do, right? And so one of the things that Microsoft did, and in one of the talks earlier, they talked about this tiering system of people, right? And there's this kind of hierarchy of needs from an admin perspective. There's very few times in any of the cloud environments that anyone has to have permanent super user root global admin. You almost never need that if you use your role-based access control correctly, right? There's a couple people, and they're very special people in your company that are super trusted that need that. But more often than not, you have a bunch of platform admins, right? And the platform admin is the Exchange admin, or the platform admin does all the networking in Azure, or the platform admin manages Salesforce, right? They need to manage that at this very high level where they have a lot of control. But even then, they don't necessarily need to be doing that all the time. The next level down is more of a resource admin. And so if you think about that in a traditional IT sense, that's your SQL admins, right? There's a dozen servers, there's 100 servers, whatever, that they have to have admin access to do something on. In the cloud, that could be the person that manages all of your MongoDB instances, right? It's somebody that has a specific resource that they need a lot of access to, but overall they don't. Then we get to developers. And developers need admin access to everything, right? Yeah, like the whole enterprise in production? No, that's not really what they need. More often than not, they need some admin access in a sandbox to do a thing that in reality, they shouldn't have any production data in anyway, right? I mean, you know, knock on wood, although I think we all have production data in tests that we don't want in test. But in theory, my sandbox has no production data, so I can do what I want. And then finally, we have auditors. And I bring auditors on this list just to say we have instances where security professionals have been given this sort of godlike read access to everything that is its own security problem. Because it's not a security professional, it's someone in the compliance department that doesn't know how to do secure things, right? All they're doing is filling out a spreadsheet somewhere, and they're not really security people. And so auditors can create a whole disclosure problem just because they've been given too much read access all over the place. But I like to use this diagnostic, and when I was in consulting, I use this diagnostic quite a bit because it's a great way to kind of analyze your organization from a risk perspective and go, okay, where's my most risk? Where can people attack me the worst? Where can I get messed up the most? And then segregate things by risk down the list, right? Because in the end, the fact that the auditor can disclose stuff doesn't give anybody control over anything usually, right? So that's not as risky as the super user root admin. So I want you to keep these kind of definitions in mind. And now is the activity. So on this nice little card you have or a piece of paper, I want you to make this grid. Because then I'll talk about what's going to go in the grid next. But just take a minute, 2 minutes, whatever, and make a grid that looks like this. Okay, see a few pins down, so I'm going to go move to the next page. Do you get the main thing here? Five types of people, 6 columns. I'll put this back up in a minute. Okay, so now the question is, in column 1, what you're going to do is, if 100% of the time you click yes to these questions, That's generally a 0, right? So do my admins use the same account to do admin stuff as they do regular stuff? That's bad, right? If you were to do that, that'd be bad. So that's a 0, right? If you've got, and if you have 100% control of that, and and it's the opposite, so they don't do the wrong thing, that's going to be a 1. Make sense? And so go down each of these groups, and for each one of these questions, put a 1 or a 0, right? So can my admins log on from untrustworthy devices? If it's yes, it's a 0. If it's no, it's a 1. Make sense? Can my admins log on with single-factor authentication on any machine? Are my admin logons accesses logged and reviewed on an ongoing basis? You get kind of the point here? And we're going to add this up and see what level we're at. That should be a not, though.
All go across the first row super user?
No, so this is, you go down the list. So it's 1, 2, 3. These are the questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so you ask each question across the row. So a few pens are down. Part of this is, hold on to this, and later you can kind of finish it up if you didn't get finished now. But for the sake of time, I'll keep going. The point is, when somebody mentioned this in an earlier presentation, was the fact that that exercise right there is really hard. Because you have to go group to group and go, is this really what we need to be doing? Does this make sense? So part of my reason for pointing that group out is that group is listed as a level of risk, right? The fact that the people that are the most at risk there are the people with the super user access. But as you go down the list, if you don't do it correctly, your developers can end up with way more control than you meant to. So let's talk about now how we're going to go ahead and secure this privileged access. Separate privileges by the risk they pose. Protect your admin. So I got asked one time, I was sitting down to dinner with a customer that we were trying to sell some stuff, and they looked at me really intently and they said, what would you really do? Like somehow I wasn't like what I was selling wasn't really what I would do. I was just selling them stuff, right? And so I said to him, well, the first thing I would do is I would stop using the account that you're using for email right now and use an admin account to do stuff. And he's like, but that's hard. And I said, well, why would you do that? So I think the big thing to note is down this list, if you fall into all of those roles, right? Because sometimes there's a developer that for whatever reason in your organization is also a super user. I don't know why that would be, but maybe they are. Those should be different accounts, right? Those shouldn't be the same thing. The other thing is, based on what you're doing from a risk, we should separate these things out. Obviously, your root super user account shouldn't be the exact same credential in test as it is in production, right? Those have a different level of risk. So when you start to define risk boundaries, those are boundaries now from moving from one level of credential to another. Because the other side of that is, if I have differing levels of credentials for different environments or different levels of risk, I can also relax requirements where it's not as important. It's not quite as important, and I'm knocking on wood here, to have the admin access to a developer's personal MSDN account necessarily be exactly the same criteria as your root super user account for all of AD. Now maybe they could screw up and put bad data in there and that could be bad, but from actually being able to pay for, afford, and manage the risk consistently, you want to separate these things out. The other thing to say about this is when you start talking about these separate identities, manage them in a separate identity zone of some sort, whether that's another Active Directory, Azure AD tenant, and I'll talk about that architecture a little bit later. Somebody was asking earlier, hey, some of these Azure pricing things, you have to pay for the whole tenant. Well, if your Azure AD admin accounts, the accounts that are administrators of Azure AD, are sitting in their own Azure AD tenant, then you can license that whole thing for full for the 20 people or 5 people that actually fall into that category for pennies. And you don't necessarily have to turn on everything for the whole organization. And I've got a more detailed architecture here in a little bit. But the other thing is, I mean, how many people are using a CyberArk, Beyond Trust, Centrify, anything like that? Some of you? Most of you? Okay. If not, get something like that. I mean, in the end, whether it's using some of the native capabilities like Azure PAM or any of these other products, having an actual sort of management zone for all of your admin stuff is a great way to separate them out and manage the risk independently. And going back to this, what I said earlier, when you look down that list, I would expect your controls at the super user level to be more comprehensive and complete than necessarily down at the auditor level. I'm probably going to let the person that's literally just looking at reports on spreadsheets have maybe less control needed to do that, depending on what their job is. Limit the time the administrators have to complete duties. And so this is really about making sure that if I'm not actually doing admin stuff, my account isn't active. I took a 50 admin population, so you got 50 people that have some level of admin access, and when you multiply that times, so many hours a year, so many days a week, there's 384,000 exposure hours. And I made up that term. I don't know that it's really an industry term, but I like it because it's easy math. And it just basically says your organized has this much exposure for your admin credentials to be, taken out. So then if I go and I say, well, okay, my admins are going to be active, they're going to work 40 hours a week normally, and then they've got 4 hours of maintenance, which your admins probably work 60 hours a week and then have 12 hours of maintenance or whatever. There's some number, right? But doing 40 and 4 is a regular work week plus a week in maintenance every week, right? Doing that, if you just reduce it with something like Azure AD PIM or CyberArk or any of this stuff, you're going to get a 70% risk reduction around the potential of those admin credentials being taken out. I work in the financial services industry that's who my customers are. And if you've got the ability to do really large trades, they make you take vacation for 2 weeks a year so they can see if you're messing around with the books, okay? And that's intentional. It's the same kind of thing here. If your admin access isn't on when you're on vacation and now something admin-y starts to occur while you're gone, that credential's compromised and you have an issue. But what I've actually seen is when you implement something like Azure AD PIM, it really looks more like about 20 hours a week because people have meetings, conference calls, vacations, they're picking up their kids from soccer, whatever. They're not actually activating their accounts for full 8-hour periods end to end. First 2 hours they're caught up in team meetings and things like that. They go activate it, get some real work done, and then they spend the rest of the day in committee on something. So with that, you actually get to this 84% risk reduction. The practical implications of this, at Microsoft, we had a huge issue with this way back in 2009. Had a huge Xbox Live outage for people changing stuff in production, in the middle of the day before we had awesome DevOps things. And so they implemented this kind of thing, and it went from during the day, less than 5% of people who needed admin access had it, because that less than 5% were active at any given time. And after hours, it was down to a minor fraction of a percent on any given day. And it just boiled down to you don't have to be super user all the time, right? You just don't need that all the time. So find a way to check it out. The way it would work in a PIM example is you're going to go out and you're going to go to this online form and hit a request. And then basically you can have it set up for management review. So some of these systems, it's automatic request depending on who the admin is or whether you want the review. And then from there, once it's approved, either auto or someone does it, the user gets a notification, they go do their job, and then it times out on its own. And all of this then ends up getting, if you're using Azure AD PIM, it gets managed in a thing, and you can see who are my admins, how often are they using it. And you can find those people that have shifted jobs, but the thing didn't come into the system because they're not activating their account anymore. And now it's like, why do you still have that access? And so this is all native in Azure. I'm not really here to push that as much as to say, regardless of what you're doing and what cloud you work in, you should be checking out these accounts and not leaving them on, because it's an easy, the investment in it is an easy risk reduction. It's something that when you talk to someone that can only talk in percentages and numbers rather than qualitative things, it's easy to talk to the CFO and go, hey, I got a 70% risk reduction. I got a, and here's the numbers and how I got the math. I've just done that multiple times, so I know it's pretty straightforward. Multi-factor auth administrators shall use to verify identity. This goes without saying, everybody knows MFA, but this is the important part that should have everyone that is not using MFA go, oh, I have a real problem now. And that is that the Attorney General in California said, hey, if you're not at least meeting the CIS critical security controls, you are not implementing reasonable security, which means you're subject to punitive damages for negligence now in court in a very clear-cut way. And so if you look at the actual CIS standards right now, I just quoted it right here, it's something that if you are breached and you weren't using MFA, there's punitive damages coming your way because it's been set down in case law and things like that. So just from a, I'm trying to think how to put this, there's all these reasons in the other talks today about, don't use a single factor, everything's hacked. This is even beyond that because now it's saying you're just not you're being negligent if you're not doing it. Have break glass accounts for global administrator access and control. And so this is really about, for the most part, if you're dealing with Azure AD in any way, or really their equivalents in GCP or in AWS, that actual global access is rarely needed to do any function. For the most part, you can use the equivalent role-based access control in the system to delegate control to people and not have that. So methodologically, what I've done with customers on the break glass side of this is create an account and, basically, depending on whether you're a global multinational or you're kind of a local small shop, make a couple of accounts with different credentials and store those credentials in different places, right? So I've got a global multinational I talk to, and basically they have a data center in Europe, a data center in Asia, and a data center in the US. They came up with an account for a break glass for each region and kept the credentials there under dual control. When I say dual control, what does that look like? Well, it can look like a lot of different things. Part of the thing is operationally, and someone was mentioning that earlier, operationally, how do I make that work? The simplest way I've seen it work is there is a vault that the password for that account is in. The admin, so the person that, and so what happens is when they walk up, and that's run by some third-party security company usually, right? It's like the vault in the building. So there's a list of authorized people that can go get that out of the vault, right? It's on a piece of paper in the vault. The authorized people walk up, get it out, and then when they use it, it actually calls the security operations center with a phone factor or something equivalent. And so the security operations center needs to be aware of you trying to use your super user in advance because they're going to deny the log on. But that way you have it under dual control. It's very easy to implement, actually, as long as you write up the procedure. And that's something I've done for other people. If that's something you want to know about, feel free to hit me up later. I'll put my stuff out there. But it's a simple implementation because most people have some kind of paper vault for certain keys, and it's very straightforward. Limit privilege to the least rights necessary to execute a task. And this is really about owner versus contributor. I'm going to use the Azure terminology. I know there's very similar terminology within the other platforms. And so the main thing is owner's not usually necessary, right? Owner gives you the ability to change ACLs and change permissions. For the most part, if you're someone who's a developer and you're responsible for deploying a bunch of container services as a part of your what you're doing, you don't really need to set the permissions on who can deploy container services. Your only job is to do that. So using contributor and writer type access relatively granularly is important. That being said, I would say doing custom RBAC roles in Azure, some of you know what I'm talking about there, is like a level 10 task, not a level 1 task. Getting to, I've got the right people, getting out of everybody global admin down to I've got some specific resources that are available is sort of the level 1 task. And so what that looks like in Azure is you're going to go ahead and at the subscription level, you're going to give people reader access if they're people that have some rights. So going back to our little rubric of platform admins would get reader at the subscription level. They'd be able to see the stuff in there because they manage the platform. Then you would give them resource groups based on their platform potentially that would be, hey, I need to be able to create stuff in here, right? And then I could go down to individual things, and if I'm the platform admin, but I've got some SQL servers in here that I want the SQL team to work with, I can either give them rights individually to those or create specific resources for SQL servers. And so this is an activity, just so you're aware, that if you're going on your Azure journey right now and you're trying to get this stuff set up, it's something Microsoft will help you with for the most part, either through the stuff we provide free online. There's a lot of classes and stuff out there, or if you're an actual enterprise customer, your account team can help you get connected to this kind of thing. The other thing to note, and this is where it gets a little dodgy, is there's a checkbox that basically says, if I'm a global admin in Azure AD, and this Azure AD tenant is assigned to an Azure subscription, it's also the owner of the Azure subscription. And there's some little dodginess there, because a lot of people don't necessarily want the identity people who are responsible for Azure AD as a global admin in Azure AD are not necessarily the same platform admin people that are in charge of Azure services. And so you want to think about this checkbox and its implications when you turn it on, just because in a lot of cases I've seen places where someone who's traditionally just been an AD admin, they understand AD, they don't know the rest of Azure, they don't know about subscriptions and all that, and they don't have a reason to necessarily, end up now carrying the load of all of that simply because they didn't know not to check the box. So that's something, yeah.
So that's in the Azure side, is that what you're saying?
This checkbox is in the on the Azure side, yeah. Use trusted systems when privileges are active for peace of mind. And so someone earlier was talking a little bit about the privileged access workstation. And so I have deployed, to my knowledge, every type of privileged access workstation that Microsoft recommends. So I've like 4 customers in engagements, and they are not all created equal. I will tell you that actually I'm a big fan of the physical workstation because it's the easiest one to get right. And it's the thing that says if this device has been built clean and I never let it interact with dirty stuff, I know it's always clean. Where any other scenario I'm looking at here is I may have built this clean sometime, but I'm browsing the internet and I'm on Amazon and I can go to some Facebook or whatever, and now all of a sudden I've made this machine dirty, and now I'm interacting with clean stuff, right? It's kind of like you don't want your brain surgeon to come in off the street without scrubbing in, and that's what the privileged access workstation looks like. That being said, this is also now a CIS control. This is something CIS is saying you need to have some strategy for this. And I would say right now, all of the stuff I listed on the right is a valid strategy from an industry perspective. Nobody's saying, CIS doesn't say it must be a physical separate box with all these controls on it. But I've seen some really interesting stuff. I saw a customer that did Chromebooks, of all things, completely locked down Chromebook that to do administration, they hit some cloud service that then they could RDP into stuff to do admin stuff. I don't necessarily recommend that one way or the other. I'm just saying I've seen a lot of ways people have gone to harden the box you're working from so that you know that what you're typing in is clean, but also know that it's on the list of CIS controls. So if you don't have a strategy for this, that's a problem, right? Because in the end, you don't have a strategy for this, you go to court, now it's an issue. So that means you should have some, even if it's just a jump box, right? The traditional Bastion host from back in 1996, I remember that like my first security class, right? The Bastion host was going to solve all my problems. I mean, in the end, you know, we've got patterns and templates in Azure for virtual machines that can look like this, and so that's at least getting started. You know, that's at least a level 1 kind of thing. But like I said, the physical box in the end is the best way to do that. And so what that might look like is if you're talking about this, you know, level 1 thing, you'd have someone with standard user log in to Azure and say, hey, turn on my jump box, okay? They do a just-in-time access to that, and so that's not a just-in-time role thing. That's just basically opening up the RDP port into the box. Because one of the big things is, from an Azure perspective, especially if you're allowing it from the internet proper, you get low and slow password attacks and all that against your virtual machines, and I have to admit, I have built a test machine with a bad password and been that guy. So I really want just-in-time access to that. But once you do that, then from the jump box, you log into the Azure portal. And some of you, anybody go to the conditional access thing earlier today? Anybody? Anyone? Use conditional access so that that admin account can only hit from the jump boxes, and it makes it a really tight scenario. Okay, so Ninja Cat, you've given us all this great advice, but what about the robots? We've got all of these service accounts out there that do stuff, right? So if you've got Puppet, Chef, Ansible, building environments, and you've got all these systems talking to systems, what do? Code requires new thoughts. Managed service identities are the safer way. And so this is really, this was alluded to in some of the earlier talks, but it's basically an auto-managed identity for access to Azure resources. And so what you end up doing is using this rather than a traditional shared, username, password, and code. We kind of talked about that in the keynote quite a bit. But the whole point here is having an identity that permissions can be applied to in applications or services to allow access, but it's automatically managed from a key management perspective with a key vault, so they're not easily extracted. It's also something that the access is tied to that application, so that while one of the things that's happened in the past is you get a service account. I mean, has anybody had like the master SQL account that ended up on every SQL server with the same password to everything, right? The whole point of managed service account, service identities, is that per service you're now creating an identity and it's not something that gets reused all over the place. Separate duties with native platform controls to reduce the risk. And so this is the part that I think I'm probably the only person talking about today, and at the whole thing. So I do want to hang out here. I kind of went through some of the other stuff quickly, simply because we've seen that in some of the other talks. But I think the big thing here is Azure as a platform, and the same principles apply to other platforms, gives you some opportunity to separate what you're doing into unique buckets of data and access to prevent your admins from going amok. So one of the big things that you can do is you can set up your storage accounts for logs and backups to be separate from an access control perspective from everything else. And so while you may have a platform admin in your current on-premises environment, typically in a larger environment, there's a sort of a Windows team and a backup team, and they're not necessarily the same people. What does that do? That allows you some separation of duty so that the guy that's running the system can't blow away the system and the backups at the same time. You want to apply that same thing as you're designing out your cloud solutions, asking the question of, are my backups under the same control plane and same people as the actual system? If not, how can I separate that, either the direct backup or copies of my backup, so that this person that owns the service can't go out and destroy all of my backups? Make sense? Just from a conceptual thing. Same thing with logs. Anytime you can make it so that your log data is going somewhere else. Someone mentioned Splunk this morning. Most of my customers are dumping their data to Splunk somewhere else. And that's fine. I mean, basically whatever you can do to make sure that both your backups and your logs are going elsewhere from an access control perspective is really good. The next thing is vetted templates and blueprints for RBAC. So what you may not know about Azure is there are a bunch of industry blueprints. So if you have a regulatory compliance like FFIEC or HIPAA or PCI, and you want to deploy an Azure service, you can go out and you can look for the Azure blueprint for PCI. And it will show you a common application platform that you can run with a script that will build it out. And then you can take that and make a blueprint for your sort of custom business blueprint where you've actually assigned all the RBAC roles to everything the way that it matters to you so that they can't be messed with. And so one of the things I see a lot of customers do is build out blueprints for their developers. So it's basically, hey, developer, you got a new project. Here's a blueprint for the resource group and the permissions and things that are going to go in that. Now go to town. Right? If you want to build app service, you want to build that, that's all there. But also the policy within Azure is preventing them from doing things they shouldn't do. So in Azure, the biggest VMs we have are G-Series VMs. They're like super expensive. You can make it so developers can't deploy G-Series VMs because they're super expensive, and why would you do that? But the big thing is from a control perspective and really, preventing misuse here, it's really about looking for how do I overlay these things. And so that's really kind of this policy side of it is, in the Azure environment, you have the ability to set audit policies. So maybe it is okay to deploy a G-Series VM if what you're testing out is some kind of big data analysis system that you're doing. That might be okay, but maybe you just want to audit on it. Okay. One of the more common things that I've run into is basically all of my financial services customers want to be notified when someone creates a public IP address. It's not that it's not okay to have public-facing things, but they want to know when a public-facing thing is created so they can add it to their Qualys and other things they're doing from a scanning perspective. So when we start talking about, when we're talking about protecting admins, one of the things we can do then is, even if I've given you contributor access to build any kind of thing, I can then overlay policy that says we never allow building, big data solutions. We just never do that. And so that's one of the nice things about the cloud providers is they do provide you the ability in a lot of cases to give people sort of generalized rights like contributor and build anything, but then take back some rights with policy to say, we never do this here. Questions about that? Locks are another really important thing, and I would say in the Azure environment in specific, there are really three things of most importance to lock. Express route gateways, that's the high-speed connectivity to Azure. Make sure you lock that so people can't accidentally delete it. VPN gateways, same reason. And key vaults. So we talked about key vault earlier. If you don't properly back up your key vault, you will lose it forever and ever, and all your stuff will be broken. Especially if you, like, I've had a customer that was messing around. They're like, oh, I wonder what happens if I do this. And then they lost all these VMs that were backed up to the key vault. So, but the big thing is, I mean, I don't know how many of you remember this, but like it was a big deal when Windows Server, when Active Directory added the ability to delete inhibit OUs, right? I mean, that's what a lock is. It's the delete inhibit. Read-only also is another option that keeps you from being able to edit things. And so one of the pieces of this is when I overlay this from a privilege perspective, one of the things this does is even if my account got out in the wild to do something bad, if I've done a good job of adding locks and policies, then the amount of damage, right, the collateral damage they can do with that is much reduced because they don't have a full set of access. And then the last part is implementing alerts. So I mentioned earlier I had this customer that what they did was they didn't want to see, they wanted to know every time a public IP is created. So they also then created an audit policy to make sure that if the policy was changed, they knew about it, right? So it's that kind of thing of, as you think about adding these extra controls, you also want to audit for their changes, right? If I build a whole RBAC implementation, I want to make sure that as those changes happen, I'm aware of it. And so this is the example, and I throw this up here because this was something that a lot of customers hadn't really thought through all the way. And so what I see kind of, and I'm hoping I can stand in front of this because I'm tired of hiding. So what I see a lot at customers, and again, it depends on your size, right? If you've got 200 users in your organization, this isn't as relevant a concept as if you're a global multinational, right? But we see a lot of customers building an Azure subscription for shared services. So that subscription has ExpressRoute. That's where you get plumbed in from a networking perspective. You might put application gateways and user-defined routing to connect you to other subscriptions. So that's how everything else gets to talk. You might see things like network virtual appliances. So if anybody use Palo Alto, I think that's pretty cool. Checkpoint, right? If those are things you're going to use in the cloud, you basically collect all this here in the shared services environment. That if you think about it from the Red Forest architecture, this becomes, it's maybe not the Red Forest, but it's a management forest, right? Conceptually, it's a place where all of my security and hardcore high-risk stuff goes here, and it has its own AAD tenant, okay? And so this is my Azure Active Directory tenant for administrators, where I create my actual, A accounts. I have a lot of customers that have A accounts or 99 accounts or whatever they call them for their admin accounts, but they're separate. These are not necessarily synced to anything. I personally think in an ideal world, these accounts live on their own, nothing's syncing in, there's no password, whatever, they're their own thing. And then I use the transitive nature of Active Directory to be able to apply permissions with these accounts into these other subscriptions. Now, these subscriptions, their default tenant is still whatever's appropriate for the environment. So you may not have all of these environments. This is just kind of a reference architecture. But a lot of customers have a dev environment and a test environment. But I have customers that have dev, test, QA, UAT, stage, and so this can blow up. And then they want to make it more complex, and then they go, oh, and I want to do this is internal, and then this is all customer facing. Well, that's fine. Make it as complicated as you need to be, but no more. So the point here is I can still provide services and access to things to people if I need to from their production accounts, but as a matter of course, I'm not. Does that make sense? So as a matter of course, no one's normal @email address is logging into the Azure portal to manage this stuff. They're all using accounts from over here. Okay, but I'm tying these tenants here because there are certain services you deploy. Like if you deploy the Azure bot service, it wants to be able to talk to the AAD that your end users are interacting with. So it's cleaner when that's the tenant that's attached. So the net of this picture and why I kind of landed here is this is kind of the ultimate expression of that, right? I now have named admin accounts. I have a separate environment that those accounts were created from and managed independently. I can deploy Azure AD Premium P2, which someone was quoting like $9 a user. Well, if I only have 100 admins times $9, that's $900 a month. It's not cheap, but it's not terribly expensive for a full-on environment with all of the controls and safety. I'm getting MFA for that. I'm getting all of the identity theft protection. I'm getting all of those features, right? And I've segregated it in such a way that it's really easy licensing-wise. Like, I don't have any questions about why I'm paying for that. And I've actually had this conversation with one customer where what they did is they said, you know what? I get this. I want to do this, and I'm just going to take this out of my security budget. Because this is a security thing. It's a security environment. And all of a sudden, everything else got cleaner, like their politics, because, oh, well, security's paying for it. I guess we're going to do this. But the net of it is everything then is super isolated. It also lets me do things like put recovery vaults and my logging and all that in this separate environment. And then I have some really awesome break glass accounts that are super hidden and taken care of here that control everything from there. So before I go on, any questions about this conceptually? Clear as mud?
Do you use the same admin accounts to manage both test and dev, or do you duplicate all the accounts, admin accounts?
So part of that comes down to, from a risk perspective, are they the same people? Because more often than not, I see sort of a root level admin account set up permissions here, and everybody that's really doing any work here are devs. And so they have a dev account that gets some access here, but they're not the same people here. And so you do end up possibly with someone with, potentially 4 accounts, right? Because that's consistent with the separate account model. But a lot of customers will compromise, and these are the same accounts, dev and test. So again, it comes back to how do you manage that risk? And so if there is no production data in both of these, then the risk calculus tends to say go ahead and use them in both. But in most cases, devs don't have admin access here.
You were saying nothing is synced. That's pure Azure.
Yeah, this Azure AD tenant, right? This one is not synced to anything. These are.
Okay.
Those have your, and so it's possible to put normal production accounts in here, but that's not the actual operational rule. That's not what you do.
So you're saying those are cloud-only accounts?
Yes. Now, technically, you can, if you have on-premises a management forest or something, you can plumb that in here, but it's independent of everything else. Any other questions? Okay. The way of the Ninja Cat is a journey, not a destination. Seek help from your peers, vendors, and their partners. And I think this is the important part of this is, this is all really hard. Like, I gave you the little diagnostic card just to kind of give you, make you think about it. But the point is, that's a hard exercise to go through. Like, to go sit down with your developers, sit down with your DBAs, and come up with what's the right strategy here to reduce the risk. But there are a lot of great partners that do this kind of work that have been there before. And especially, like I said earlier, for some of these things, Microsoft will help you with that as long as it's Azure related. So feel free to reach out, use the resources that are out there. There's tons of great people here. Like, use this as networking to find those partners if this is something you want to do, because I know lots of people are talking about the same topics. And so with that, this is how you get a hold of me. There's my email. Feel free. I'm totally available. I do post quite an eclectic mix of stuff on Twitter, so I don't know if you want to be on that, but LinkedIn will be very professional and on point at all times.